All right, everybody, this is part 3 of the Sonoma State Dynasty deep dive here on the Rabbit Hole Sports and Media YouTube channel. Wanted to start off touching on a couple of other things regarding the gameplay difficulty and sliders, some that I kind of forgot to mention, but also tie a little more to offense and defense. So, starting off, I wanted to touch on the fact that we're adjusting for longer quarters. And what I mean by that is I read an article by EA Sports. This was a couple years ago, so it could have changed a little bit. But it was basically saying that their gameplay data and how they try to get it is they want the scores, the final scores of their online games, to be similar to the average final score of real games. So, not saying that's flawed logic, but if you're playing the video game, it's either 4, 5, 6 minute quarters. I don't know what the default is for online play. A real game's 15-minute quarters. So we're trying to limit how easy it is to create those explosive plays and, make it a more elongated process. And then also on varsity, I feel like you get a more realistic animation threshold in terms of, especially on defense, when guys go for interceptions and swats, and the level of risk versus reward is weighed a little more realistic on varsity. So that's why I like to get it on the varsity difficulty, but then kind of use the sliders to create the true difficulty in the game. So the varsity difficulty in many ways is to create realistic animations that you'll see in a 15-minute or 60 total minute football game. And last but not least, I do use certain things to determine slider thresholds. So an example for that, the CPU pass coverage, that's really dictated off how our guys should be able to get open. And so in the game, it's a little too easy for guys with speed to just blow by guys. And I get that, in a vacuum that makes sense. But when you start tying in technique and the ability for truly good defensive backs to overcome those things, it's not as simple in real life as it is in the game. So that's one of the big things I'm trying to control, is how easy it is for us to run by guys. I don't think we had anyone win on a straight go route the entirety of last season. So it's really us having to attack leverage properly and numbers properly, as opposed to just running by guys consistently. Now, again, as we get better, should that be happening occasionally? Am I saying guys don't win just straight up running down the field one-on-one? No, what I'm saying is the guys on our team, and if you've watched and seen the overalls, you know this, we shouldn't just be running by guys routinely down the field a few times a game. That's something we should really have to work for and create through doing other things. So that's what I'm trying to do and what I am basing the sliders off of. With that being said, let's get into some offensive scheme. Starting off, what is offensive and defensive scheme? Right? I'm trying to put this in a frame where if you don't know much about football X's and O's, this will make a little bit of sense. We'll work from the ground up. If you already have some knowledge, we will get into not super deep concepts, but there may be a point where if you don't have a deeper knowledge of things, you start going, what's going on? And that may be more of the point where if you do know some things, you're kind of like, oh, okay, this is what I was here for. So I hope we're pleasing both sides. Let's start off scheme. We're trying to maximize our strength, minimize our weaknesses. Because having more talent essentially equates to having more resources, but winning games and building a program and being successful, it comes down to how you utilize those resources. And it goes way deeper than what you're doing on the field, obviously. But from a simply schematic standpoint, it's how we use those resources on the field to set ourselves up to win. And so a very brief kind of history / school of offenses tutorial, I suppose. I would call these kind of the 3 dominant eras / dominant schools of offense in college football. You got the option. That's, much more old school today, ran primarily by the service academies, Army, Navy, Air Force. They rely on smaller, quicker linemen because of restrictions on how big you can be in the service. Those service academies don't have those big 330, 320-pound linemen that can just get downhill and dominate, but they do have some quicker guys, and so those schemes, the wing T, flex bone, single wing, double wing, wishbone, all utilize that. Big premise of it that we borrow in parts of our offense is that essentially you're taking one player that would normally be blocked, not blocking him, to further allow your blockers more double teams on other guys, and instead you're going to read that defender and decide who gets the ball based off of what he does. So I hope that makes sense if you don't have much knowledge of option football. Pro style and one back, those are very professional oriented systems, more tight ends, fullbacks, more of that balance of blocking and perimeter threats. And then the spread is more receivers, more spacing on the perimeter. Those are what I would call the primary schools of spread. Not the spot to do a super extensive deep dive on them, but to do a quick little breakdown. The run and shoot is essentially receivers have a choice of what route they can run based on what the defense does after the ball is snapped, and a little bit based on what they're showing pre-snap. Spread option is essentially borrowing those concepts in the option offenses, but spreading them out. The power spread borrows a lot more of what you would call gap run game, so pulling linemen, running between the tackles, between the lines of scrimmage, or between the gaps of the line of scrimmage. You're not trying to get it to the perimeter as much, but you're still running more spread out formations. Air raid is a pass-heavy, spread-oriented offense. You don't quite have true option routes like you do in the run and shoot, but it does give receivers the freedom to kind of adjust the depth they run routes to, and it does give them the option to settle in spaces in zone coverage or continue to run across the field or down the field against man-to-man coverage. So there is adaptation of routes, but run and shoot, think a lot more like you could break in or out. Air raid, it's more like you could run your route 10 yards down the field or 15 yards down the field. Again, very simplistic or oversimplification of things, but I think that's the best way to kind of differentiate those things. And then veer and shoot is essentially a spread on steroids. It's heavily spread personnel, but you're really putting your receivers sideline to sideline, so wider splits. We do borrow elements of that in our offense, but then they also borrow a lot of sort of power spread and gap scheme run concepts to pair with that wide spacing. And essentially you're trying to limit the defense's ability to disguise what they're doing, because there's a lot more of what you would call dead space on the field, where guys got to kind of make quick decisions and go immediately to wherever their responsibility is once the ball is snapped. So there's less ability for the defense to kind of linger and make it difficult for the offense to decipher what they're doing. The real limitation with that is because you have such wide spacing from your receivers, you do rely heavily on in-breaking routes. So the shoot part of the veer and shoot is because they do run a lot of option run and shoot oriented concepts to kind of make up for that lack of ability to break inside and outside. They do want to give their receivers the option to run, ins, posts, curls, and still adjust their routes based on what the defense is doing to account for their limited ability to break in and out because of their spacing. Getting into professional football, ground and pound. Think early football, running the ball, running between the tackles, physical, kind of that cliche, I don't even know what word you want to put in, kind of Neanderthal type of football where it's just dudes clashing their heads. West Coast, vertical pass, Air Coryell. This is when you started seeing the pass game evolve a little bit more. They happened really at similar times. Air Coryell evolved more in Well, at San Diego State in college football first, where the West Coast really evolved under Bill Walsh, originally with the Cincinnati Bengals, made famous with the 49ers. Air Coryell was made famous in the NFL when Don Coryell took over as head coach of the San Diego Chargers in 1978, 77, or 78 is when he was hired as head coach. And ironically enough, my grandma actually babysat for Dan Fouts, who was, for his kids, who was the quarterback for that Chargers team when Don Coryell took over. So weird how close of a family connection I have to it, and here we are talking about it years later. But the differentiation, the oversimplistic version is the West Coast is underneath routes, shorter throws, kind of using small, short routes to replace the run game, where the Air Coryell offense is using that ground and pound run game mixed with a vertical over-the-top passing game. Now, as those offenses have evolved, that doesn't really do them justice to accurately describe them. So a way I would kind of differentiate them, and again, I don't know how consensus this is. In the world of football, I definitely would say I have a semi-unique perspective in that I played, but I haven't played in over a decade, and a lot of my knowledge of schematics and really understanding the game has actually come from my time since playing. So, I have an understanding to kind of relate things to, the inside of football, but at the same time, I would say I can kind of relate things as well in a way that's not a, common football nomenclature kind of standpoint, if that makes sense. But a way I would differentiate West Coast and Air Coryell is West Coast, I would think more layered concepts. So, one guy running underneath, one guy running deeper in the same spot of the field, where Air Coryell is more about isolating matchups down the field, finding your best one-on-one matchup and attacking it. And then West Coast, another differentiation, they deal more in full concepts. And so what I mean by that is when you call plays, you would say like stick, right? And everyone knows what they're supposed to do based off of that. Where Air Coryell, you would use a number, and each number correlates to the receiver's route. So you'd say like 6, 8, 9. And, each receiver knows which number correlates with them, and they run their route based off of that. So that is another difference. But modern era, a lot more analytics, which has led to a lot more motions and shifting. So that's why you see teams come to the line of scrimmage in one look, change their look. You'll see guys moving as the ball is snapped. That's not, and I want to clarify this, not all of these things are stagnant where you saw, one school and then a complete flip and a complete flip. There is a fluidity where all of these things to a degree have existed at different times. Like in terms of the vertical pass and spreading it out and using the pass to fully space the field. The earliest clip I've seen of that was of a coach named Sid Gilman, who actually was the first coach of the Chargers when they were an AFL franchise, and that was back in the 50s and 60s. He was talking about using the whole width of the field in order to stress the defense. And then there's actually a book I think was written back in the 50s by a man named Glenn Tiger Ellison, which was about the original run and shoot offense. And so even though that became originally popularized with Houston in like the later 80s, early 90s, and probably even was ran by some teams before that, and was really popularized by Hawaii in, the June Jones era, which was early 2000s, up to like 2007, 2008. But these things have been around in various forms, really throughout the beginning of football. And so for us, it's about what can we take away from each of these schools, each of these eras, and best apply it to our team to win games. And from everything I've learned, my team philosophy bows down to this. We want to pound it and blow it open. And bear with me, because I know, what are we talking? That's a lot. I get it. We want to find the ultimate balance of running in the middle, pounding it, and throwing it deep, blowing open the coverage. That's what they say in football when you start getting behind safeties, that you blew open the top of the defense. So that's what we're trying to do. We want to find that ultimate balance, and that really whittles down to the fact that the ball is snapped at a certain point every play. So the safest and quickest way to attack is to run the ball right through or as close to the point where the ball was snapped and hand it to someone as close to the point where the ball was snapped, because that minimizes risk. Because I would say every play has a setup and an attack point, right? And by that, I mean there's all the stuff you do before you get the ball to the guy you want the ball in the hands of, and then there's what happens once the ball gets in the hands of that guy. So when you run it in the middle, you minimize that risk in that setup point, but then you definitely need a lot more to go right in that attack portion of things with your blocking, where throwing, you need a lot more to go right in the setup, but once you get it in the hands of whoever you want to get it in the hands of, they really only need to beat one or two guys to make something happen, and they're typically already down the field to do that. So we want to find that ultimate balance. And so, you could really just say, well, then we're just going to hand it up the middle and throw it deep. And yes, in essence, that's what we're trying to do. But I think given your personnel, you have to find what you have to do in order to make that possible. So in season 1, I devised, and I like to come up with names. You don't need to come up with names. We aren't technically reinventing the wheel here by any means. We're just borrowing from different things to make a semi-unique scheme. But I call it the scat and shoot, mix of a spread option and veer and shoot influence. And by that, I mean we're running a lot of option concepts. That's why you see a lot of those plays where we have like a tight end or fullback or running back typically kind of running across behind the line of scrimmage, and we fake a handoff or, sometimes give it to the running back. Those plays don't typically make the highlight reel because they get stuffed. But if we get to keep it on the edge or get it in the hands of that guy on the perimeter, we get big plays. And that's an option concept. So we're essentially borrowing the option, but doing it in the spread version. So spread option, and then I say veer and shoot influence because we do utilize that wide receiver spacing. But again, I don't like how much it limits your ability to break in versus out. So we don't use it consistently, but I think it is a really helpful element to get you more space to run the ball. And that is a big part of the original veer and shoot, which was really ran by like early 2010s Baylor with like RG3 and Bryce Petty. Spacing, read the numbers in the box. And what I mean by that in the box is around the line of scrimmage, you typically have at least 5 linemen, and then you can add in tight ends or fullbacks as blockers. And the defense is typically going to either match or try to get an extra defender around the line of scrimmage. So if you have 5 linemen and 4 receivers and a running back, they're going to match the linemen and do 5 players in the box. That could be 3 linemen, 2 linebackers, 4 linemen, and a linebacker. You would technically never see like 5 true linemen except for some peculiar situations, but you do see times where teams will line up 5 dudes on the line and not have like a second level, but typically it's linebacker type players on the edge, and we'll talk about that a little more in the defensive side of things. But that's what the veer and shoot is trying to do. They're trying to read your numbers in the box, and then they're trying to go off of that. They also try to go up tempo, so they want to go quick and force you to have to align quickly. And we don't do a ton of that, so that's why I wouldn't say we're a full veer and shoot team. We're more spread option with veer and shoot influence. We want to maximize defensive spacing. We want to get the ball to the flat quickly, and we do have a heavily option-oriented run game. And by doing that, we can get the defense focused on underneath and perimeter areas of the field, and that allows us to do, dare I say, the thing we want to do: pound it and blow it open. That's when we can get the defense to put extra guys outside, put extra guys down near the line of scrimmage. That's what we're going to need in order to run it up the middle and get it deep, because we don't have the personnel to just say, hey, we want to go after this matchup. We have to we want to go after matchups, but we need to dictate where the help is, and then off certain matchups, get certain leverages. I'm getting a little too into detail. Maybe I'll do like a super, super deep dive if I have a Patreon or something one day where I just get crazy with it for the football gurus and you guys can really rip me apart on what you like or whatnot. I'd be super down for that. But season 2, we evolve into an offense I call the Coryell spread.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Air Coryell and your pilot Dan Fouts, welcome to San Diego, home of the AFC Western Division champion Chargers.
So, we're taking that Don Coryell element of trying to throw it deep, but we want that gap-oriented run game, pulling linemen, running between the tackles. But we want to do it with more spread out formation. So, we can do this because we improved on the O-line. We can center a little more of our core scheme around a power run game, and we can use these spread run concepts and more traditional play action to create looks to throw deep. I would say we almost, and again, this might be a little beyond common knowledge, but we're a little more multiple this year than spread. I leave the spread in there just because as we face teams where we're a little more overmatched, we will lean into the spread a little more. But when we are on more of a level playing field, we will be a lot more under center. So the quarterback literally with his hands under center, as opposed to shotgun where he's standing 5 or 6 yards behind the center. We mix that in a little more, where last year we were pretty much exclusively in the shotgun. And one of the main reasons I call it a Coryell spread, beyond the fact that, yeah, I would say I do like that style of just going power run game and a vertical passing game, but a big element of that too is, again, getting more nuanced into what made that offense special, is they really were one of the first teams to start utilizing the slot. And what that is a third receiver that is not on the outside, if that makes sense. And so up till that point in football, typically teams had 2 receivers again, teams would move it around, but most commonly 1 receiver on the outside on each side of the field. You would have a tight end on one side of the line. That side would be the strong side. Typically the right side is your strong side. We won't get too into, identifying strong sides and all of that right now. And then you would have a fullback and a running back, sometimes 2 tight ends, sometimes 2 running backs. It would depend, but typically 2 receivers. And the Coryell offense, the Air Coryell offense, started utilizing the slot more, started using the tight end more on the outside because they had a really elite pass-catching tight end in Kellen Winslow, and he deserves a lot of credit for the tight ends you see more in today's game that are thought of as more predominant pass catchers. Again, there were great pass-catching tight ends before him, but he was one of the first guys that a scheme was kind of centered around his full versatility. And to a degree, he was kind of a hybrid receiver and a tight end. But anyway, and then another element of that is, as much as the Coryell offense at that time was known for being this wide open pass, happy offense, it was very 50-50. If you go back and find the run pass splits of the early 80s, I want to say in 1981, which is kind of the biggest thought of historical year for that offense, although 1982 was probably their best passing year, but it was a strike year, so we don't have the full numbers on it. But anyway, in 81, I want to say they threw 52% of the time, and that led the league, and that would be around 27th or 28th in the league now. So I would say don't think of us as a Coryell spread as more of a pass-heavy offense. We are a lot more power spread, utilizing a lot of Air Coryell principles, if that makes sense. But this is our starting unit this season. At left tackle, we got Kalen Franklin, the senior. He's a right tackle, but 81 at left tackle, so we're moving him over there. We got senior DeMarcus Perkins. He is a tank, man. 6'5", 329, 95 strength, a beast. Tariq Williams at center. He is big for a center, 6'5", 320, but he only has an 83 strength rating, so on the game he plays much smaller. So that's why he's at center. And then we got a pair of freshmen on the right side, Miguel Weeks, a pair of 4-stars. Miguel Weeks and Suachu. Suachu, I originally planned to be the left tackle, but after looking at how the ratings played out, I like him more on the right side and Franklin on the left side. And then quarterback, TB5, Teron Barnes. If you've watched, you know him. He is a playmaker. We're going to see if we can have another great season with him. But at the same time, I kind of want to get the ball out of his hands a little bit. Not in a, oh, he's, not good sort of way, but in like a, hey, we asked him to do a lot. So let's, see if we can have some other guys carry the load. And one of those guys could be Keontae Tyson. I think he's due for a huge season. Could not get him as involved as I wanted to last year, but this year a lot more straight handoffs, so he should be known. Look out for Keontae Tyson in this season, the 80 overall senior tailback. Our number one receiver, X receiver typically refers to your guy on the line, and Z receiver typically refers to more of your speed guy who lines up a step behind the line of scrimmage. But our X receiver, CJ Peaks, our Z receiver, Javon Moore, and this is a big reason why I say we're not a big pass-happy offense. We don't have... Our best personnel isn't on the perimeter. That's why. And you can see it there. Listen, they can win in various ways, and they fit what we want to do in our scheme. But again, we got to center ourselves around a strong running game and some play action this year. Then the tight end, Scott McLaughlin, the best 74 overall you'll ever see. I love this guy. He is a beast of a blocker. He is fast. I'm almost curious if there's some team builder glitch going on where his overall isn't as high. If you download this team, it is available on the team builder download on College Football 25. You'll see if you watch season 1, not all the overalls perfectly match up, and that's because when you get into Dynasty, the overalls change. So I did tweak them a little bit to try to bring them back to what they were, but at the same time, some of them, I was like, man, I just can't imagine them being, any better in pure ratings, but the overall does not match. And Scott McLaughlin was an example of that. He was like a 68, 69 overall, and I was like, he just does not play like it, so I'm not going to mess around with it anymore. So, hey, he's a 74 overall. I would rate him higher, but whatever. And then at slot back, we have Spencer Strickland, and that's something I borrowed from more of those option offenses. A slot back is someone who would essentially line up where a tight end would be, but off the ball and next to a tackle. A wingback is another position. He would typically line up next to the tight end off the ball. So that's my understanding. If you have a different understanding of that, let me know. They're kind of used interchangeably, but they're heavy in the option offense. But this is how we find our matchups, because Spencer Strickland is a pass-catching running back, but by putting him in the slot, it forces the defense to either play 3 corners on the field, or what you would call sub-personnel. We'll get more into this in the next part about the defense, but base personnel has 4 defensive backs and 7 linebackers / D linemen, and then sub-personnel starts adding in a defensive back. So in modern football, you see a lot more 5 defensive back defense because teams have leaned into a lot more 3 and even 4 receiver offenses. We kind of go with a 2.5. So with Spencer Strickland, if they do go with their sub-personnel 5 defensive backs, we can shift into a 2-back formation and we have an advantage running the ball. If they go with what you would call base defense with their 7 linemen / linebackers, we have a good matchup typically with Spencer Strickland in the slot throwing the ball, and if they want to account for that, they typically will then need to slide in a safety, and that's when we can open up things on the outside with CJ Peaks and Javon Moore. So Spencer Strickland and that slot back position, really important for us, and is what allows us to kind of find our best matchups and level the playing field. But that is going to do it for the offensive portion of things, part 3. I know this was a lot of information, so I'm sorry if it was an overload, but check out part 4 about the defense.